This is Fergus Hume's The Green Mummy, a work now in the public domain. Chapter 26, The Appointment. Poor Lucy Kendal was terribly grieved and shocked when the full account of her stepfather's iniquity was revealed to her. Archie tried to break the news as delicately as possible, but no words could soften the sordid story. Lucy at first could not believe it possible that a man, whom she had known for so long and to whom she was related, would behave in such a base way. To convince her, Hope was forced to let her read the account in Mrs. Jasher's handwriting. When acquainted with the contents, the poor girl's first desire was to have the matter hushed up, and she implored her lover with tears to suppress the damning document. "That is impossible," said Hope firmly, "and if you think again, my dear, you will not repeat such a request. It is absolutely necessary that this should be placed in the hands of the police, and that the truth should become as widely known as possible. Unless the matter is settled once and for all, someone else may be accused of this murder." "But the disgrace," wept Lucy, hiding her face on her lover's shoulder. He slipped his arm round her waist. "My darling, the disgrace exists whether it be public or private. After all, the Professor is no relation." "No, but everyone knows that I am his stepdaughter." "Everyone," echoed Archie, with an assumed lightness. "My dear, everyone in this instance only means the handful of people who live in this out-of-the-way village. Your name will not appear in the papers, and even if by chance it does, you will soon be changing it for mine. I think the best thing that can be done is for you to come with me to London next week and marry me. Then we can go to the south of France for the rest of the winter until you recover. When we return and set up house in London, say in a year, the whole affair will be forgotten." "But how can you bear to marry me when you know that I come of such a bad stock?" wept Lucy, a trifle more comforted. "My dear, must I remind you again that you are no relation to Professor Braddock? You have not a drop of his wicked blood in your veins. And even if you had, I should still marry you. It is you I love, and you I marry, so there is no more to be said. Come, darling, say that you will become my wife next week." "But the Professor," Archie smiled grimly. He found it difficult to forgive Braddock for the disgrace he had brought on the girl. "I don't think we'll ever be troubled again with the Professor," he said after a pause. "He has bolted into the unknown with that infernal Kanaka." "But why did he fly, Archie?" "Because he knew that the game was up. Mrs. Jasher wrote out this confession and told Cockatoo, when he entered the room to get the emerald, that she had written it. To save his master, the Kanaka stabbed the wretched woman, and, had Random and I not arrived, he would have secured the confession. I really believe he came back again out of the mist in the small hours of the morning to steal it. But when he found that all was vain, he returned here and told the Professor that the story of the murder had been written out. Therefore there was nothing left to Braddock but to fly. Although," added Hope with an afterthought, "I can't imagine why those two fugitives should drag that confounded mummy with them." "But why should the Professor fly?" asked Lucy again. "According to what Mrs. Jasher writes, he did not strangle poor Sidney. No. And I will do him the justice to say that he had no idea of having his assistant murdered. It was Cockatoo's savage blood which came out in the deed, and maybe it can be explained by the Kanaka's devotion to the Professor. It was the same way in the murder of Mrs. Jasher. By killing Bolton, the Kanaka hoped to save the emeralds for Braddock. In stabbing Mrs. Jasher, he hoped to save the Professor's life." "Oh, Archie, will they hang my father?" Hope winced. "Call him your stepfather," he said quickly. "No, dear, I do not think he will be hanged, but as an accessory after the fact he will certainly be condemned to a long term of imprisonment. Cockatoo, however, assuredly will be hanged, and a good job too. He is only a savage, and as such is dangerous in a civilized community. I wonder where they have gone. Did anyone hear them going?" "No," said Lucy unhesitatingly. "Cook came up this morning to my room and said that my father, I mean my stepfather, had gone away with Cockatoo and with the Green Mummy." I don't know why she should have said that, as the Professor often went away unexpectedly. Perhaps she heard rumours in the village and put two and two together. I cannot tell. Some instinct must have told her. But I dare say Braddock and his accomplice fled under cover of the mist and in the small hours of the morning. They must have known that the confession would bring the officers of the law to this house. I hope they will escape," murmured Lucy. "Well, I am not sure," said Hope hesitatingly. "Of course, I should like to avoid a scandal for your sake, and yet it is only right that the two of them should be punished. Remember, Lucy dear, how Braddock has acted all along in deceiving us. He knew all, and yet not one of us suspected him. While Archie was thus comforting the poor girl, Gartley village was in an uproar. Everyone was talking about this new crime, and everyone was wondering who had stabbed the unlucky woman. As yet, the confession of Mrs. Jasher had not been placed in the hands of the police, and everyone was ignorant that Cockatoo was the criminal who had escaped in the fog. Inspector Date speedily arrived with his myrmidons on the scene and made the cottage his headquarters. Later in the day, Hope, having taken a cold bath to freshen himself up, came with the confession. This he gave to the officer and explained the whole story of the previous night. Date was more than astonished, he was astounded. He read the confession and made notes. Then he sent for Sir Frank Random and examined him in the same strict way as he had examined the artist. Jane was also questioned. Widow Anne was put in the witness box, so as to report about the clothes, and in every way Date gathered material for another inquest. At the former one, he had only been able to place scanty evidence before the jury, and the verdict had been unsatisfactory to the public. But on this occasion, seeing that the witnesses he could bring forward would solve the mystery of the first death as well as the second, Inspector Date exulted greatly. He saw himself promoted and his salary raised, and his name praised in the papers as a zealous and clever officer. By the time the inquest came to be held, the inspector had talked himself into believing that the whole mystery had been solved by himself. But before that time came another event happened which astonished everyone, and which made the final phase of the Green Mummy crime even more sensational than it had been. And heaven knows that from beginning to end there had been no lack of melodrama of the most lurid description. Don Pedro de Gallangos was exceedingly amazed at the unexpected turn which the case had taken. That he should have been trying to solve a deep mystery for so long, and that the solution all the time had been in the hands of the professor, startled him exceedingly. He admitted that he had never liked Braddock, but explained that he had not expected to hear that the fiery little scientist was such a scoundrel. But, as Don Pedro confessed, it was an ill wind which blew him some good, when the upshot of the whole mysterious tragic business was the restoration of at least one emerald. Sir Frank brought the gem to him on the afternoon of the day succeeding Mrs. Jasher's death, and while the whole village was buzzing with excitement. It was Random who gave all details to Donna Inez and her father, leading from one revelation to another, until he capped the whole extraordinary story by producing the splendid gem. "Mine! Mine!" said Don Pedro, his dark eyes glittering. "Thanks be to the Virgin and the saints," and he bowed his head to make the sign of the cross devoutly on his breast. Donna Inez clapped her hands and her eyes flashed, for, like every woman, she had a profound love for jewels. "Oh, how lovely, Frank! It must be worth no end of money." Professor Braddock sold the other to some Indian Rajah in Amsterdam, through an agent, I presume for £3,000. "I shall get more than that," said Don Pedro quickly. "The professor sold his jewel in a hurry and had no time to bargain, but sooner or later I shall get £5,000 for this." He held the gem in the sunlight, where it glowed like an emerald sun. "Why, it is worthy of a king's crown." "I fear you will never get the other gem," said Random regretfully. "I believe that it is on its way to India, if Mrs. Jasher can be trusted." "Never mind. I shall be content with this one, Signor. I have simple tastes, and this will do much to restore the fortunes of my family. When I go back with this and the Green Mummy, all those Indians who know of my descent from the ancient Incas will be delighted and will pay me fresh reverence." "But you forget," said Random, frowning, "the Green Mummy has been taken away by Professor Braddock." "They cannot have gone far with it," said Donna Inez, shrugging. "I don't know so much about that, dearest," said Sir Frank. "Apparently, since they handled it at the time of the murder, it is easier carried about than one would think. And then they fled last night, or rather in the small hours of this morning, under cover of a dense fog." "It is clear enough now," said de Gallangos, peering through the window, where a pale winter sun shone in a clear steel-hued sky. "They are bound to be caught in the long run." "Do you wish them to be caught?" asked Random abruptly. "Not the professor. For Miss Lucy's sake I hope he will escape, but I trust that the savage who killed these two unfortunate people will be brought to the gallows." "So do I," said Random. "Well, Don Pedro, it seems to me that your task in Gartley is ended. All you have to do is to wait for the inquest and see Mrs. Jasher buried, poor soul. Then you can go to London and remain there until after Christmas." "But why should I remain in London?" asked the Peruvian, surprised. Random glanced at Donna Inez, who blushed. "You forget that you have given your consent to my marriage with Ah, yes, Don Pedro smiled gravely. I return with the jewel to Lima, but I leave my other jewel behind. Never mind, said the girl, kissing her father. When Frank and I are married, we will come to Callao in his yacht. Our yacht, said Random, smiling. Our yacht, repeated Donna Inez, and then you will see, father, that I have become a real English lady. But don't entirely forget that you are a Peruvian, said Don Pedro playfully, and a descendant of Inca Caxus, added Donna Inez. Then she flirted her fan, which she was rarely without, and laughed in her English lover's face. Don't forget, Signor, that you marry a princess. I marry the most charming girl in the world, he replied, catching her in his arms, rather to the scandal of de Gallangos, who had stiff Spanish notions regarding the etiquette of engaged couples. There is one thing you must do for me, Signor, he said quietly, before we leave this most unhappy case of murder and theft forever. What is that? Asked Sir Frank, turning with Inez in his arms. Tonight at 8 o'clock, Captain Hervey. The sailor Gustav Vasa, if you prefer the name, steams down the river in his new boat, the Firefly. I received a note from him. He displayed a letter, stating that he will pass the jetty of Gartley at that hour and will burn a blue light. If I fire a pistol, he will send off a boat with a full account of the theft of the mummy of Inca Caxus, written by himself. Then I will hand his messenger 50 gold sovereigns, which I have here, added Don Pedro, pointing to a canvas bag on the table, and we will return. I wish you to go with me, Signor, and also I wish your friend Mr. Hope to come. Do you anticipate treachery from Captain Hervey? Asked Random. I should not be surprised if he tried to trick me in some way, and I wish you and your friend to stand by me. Were this man alone, I would go alone, but he will have a boat's crew with him. It is best to be safe. I agree with you, said Random quickly. Hope and I will come, and we will take revolvers with us. It doesn't do to trust this blackguard. Ho, ho! I wonder if he knows of the Professor's flight. No, considering the terms upon which the Professor stood with Hervey, I should think he would be the last person he would trust. I wonder what has become of the man. And more people than Don Pedro wondered as to the whereabouts of Braddock and his servant, for everyone was inquiring and hunting. The marshes round the cottage were explored. The great house itself was searched, as well as many cottages in the village, and inquiries were made at all the local stations. But all in vain. Braddock and Cockatoo, along with the cumbersome mummy in its case, had vanished as completely as though the earth had swallowed them up. Inspector Date's idea was that the pair had taken the mummy to Gartley Pier after the search made by the soldiers, and they had launched the boat, which Cockatoo, judging from his visit to Pierside, apparently kept hidden in some nook. It was probable, said Date, the two had rowed down the river and had managed to get on board some outward-bound tramp. They could easily furbish up some story, and as Braddock doubtless had money, could easily buy a passage for a large sum. The tramp being outward-bound, her captain and crew would know nothing of the crime, and even if the fugitives were suspected, they would be shipped out of England if the bribe was sufficiently large. So it was apparent that Inspector Date had not much opinion of tramp steamer skippers. However, as the day wore on to night, nothing was heard of Braddock or Cockatoo or the mummy, and when night came, the village was filled with local reporters and with London journalists asking questions. The Warrior Inn did a great trade in drink, and beds and meals, and the rustics reaped quite a harvest in answering questions about Mrs. Jasher and the Professor and the weird-looking Kanaka. Meshon reporters dared to invade the pyramids, where Lucy was weeping in sorrow and shame, but Archie, reinforced by 2 policemen, sent to his aid by Date, soon sent them to the right-about. Hope would have liked to remain with Lucy all the evening, but at 7:30 he was forced to meet Don Pedro and Random outside the fort in order to go to Gartley Jetty. Chapter 27. Bythe River. As the hunt for the fugitives had continued all day, everyone, police, villagers and soldiers, were weary and disheartened. Consequently, when the 3 men met near the fort, there seemed to be few people about. This was just as well, as they would have been followed to the jetty, and obviously it was best to keep the strange meeting with Captain Hervey as secret as possible. However, Don Pedro had taken Inspector Date into his confidence, as it was impossible to get past the cottage of the late Mrs. Jasher, in which the officer had taken up his quarters without being discovered. Date was quite willing that the trio should go, but stipulated that he should come also. He had heard all about Captain Hervey in connection with the mummy, and thought that he would like to ask that sailor a few leading questions. And if I see fit, I shall detain him until the inquest is over, said Date, which was mere bluff, as the inspector had no warrant to stop the Firefly or arrest her skipper. 3 men, therefore, were joined by Date when they came along the cinder path abreast of the cottage, and the quartet proceeded further immediately, walking amongst the bents and grasses to the rude old wooden jetty, near which Hervey intended to stop his ship. The night was quite clear of fog, strange to say, considering the late sea mist, but a strong wind had been blowing all day and the fog wreaths were entirely dispersed. A full moon rode amongst a galaxy of stars, which twinkled like diamonds. The air was frosty, and their feet scrunched the earth and grasses and coarse herbage underfoot as they made rapidly for the embankment. When they reached the top, they could see the jetty clearly almost below their feet, and in the distance the glittering lights of Pierside. Vague forms of vessels at anchor loomed on the water, and there was a stream of light where the moon made a pathway of silver. After a casual glance, the 3 men proceeded down the slope to the jetty. 3 of them at least had revolvers, since Hervey was an ill man to tackle, but probably Date, who was too dense to consider consequences, was unarmed. Neither did Don Pedro think it necessary to tell the officer that he and his 2 companions were prepared to shoot if necessary. Inspector Date, being a prosy Englishman, would not have understood such lawless doings in his own sober, law-abiding country. When they reached the jetty, Don Pedro glanced at his watch, illuminating the dial by puffing his cigar to a ruddy glow. It was just after 8 o'clock, and even as he looked, an exclamation from Date made him raise his head. The inspector was pointing out, stream to a large vessel which had steamed inshore as far as was safe. Probably Hervey was watching for them through a night glass, for a blue light suddenly flared on the bridge. Don Pedro, according to his promise, fired a pistol, and it was then that Date learned that his companions were armed. "What the devil did you do that for?" he inquired angrily. "It will bring my constable down on us." "I do not mind, since you can control them," said de Gallegos coolly. "I had to give the signal." "And we all have revolvers," said Random quickly. "Hervey is not a very safe man to tackle, Inspector." "Do you expect to fight?" said Date, while they all watched a boat being lowered. "If so, you might have told me, and I should have brought a revolver also, not that I think it is needed. The sight of my uniform will be enough to show this man that I have the law behind me." "I don't think that will matter to Hervey," said Archie dryly. "So much as I have seen of him suggests to me that he is a singularly lawless man." Date laughed good-humouredly. "It seems to me, gentlemen, that you have brought me on a filibustering expedition," he said, and seemed to enjoy the novel situation. Date had been wrapped up in the cotton wool of civilization for a long time, but his primitive instincts rose to the surface, now that he had to face a probable rough-and-tumble fight. "But I don't expect there will be any scrap," he said regretfully. "My uniform will settle the matter." It certainly seemed to annoy Captain Hervey considerably, for, as the boat approached the shore and the moonlight revealed a distinctly official overcoat, he gave an order. The man stopped rowing, and the boat rocked gently, some distance from the jetty. "You've got a high old crowd with you, Don Pedro," sang out Hervey, in great displeasure. "Is that Angel in the military togs with the brass buttons, the almighty aristocrat?" "No, I am here," cried out Random, laughing at the description which he recognised. "My friend Hope is with me, and Inspector Date. I suppose you have heard what has happened?" "Yes, I've taken it all in," said Hervey sourly. "I guess the news is all over Pierside." "Well, it's none of my picnic, I reckon. So chuck that gold over here, Don Pedro, and I'll send along the writing." "No," said Don Pedro, prompted by Date. "You must come ashore." "I guess not," said Hervey vigorously. "You want to run me in." "For that theft of 30 years ago," laughed de Gallegos. "Nonsense. Come along. You are quite safe." "Shan't take your damned word for it," growled Hervey. "But if those 2 gents can swear that there's no trickery, I'll come." "I can depend on the word of an English aristocrat anyhow. Come along, you are quite safe," said Sir Frank, and Hope echoed his words. Thus being made certain, Hervey gave an order, and the boat was rowed right up to the beach, immediately below the jetty. The 4 men were about to descend, but Hervey seemed anxious to avoid giving them trouble. "Hold on, gents," said he, leaping ashore. "I'll come up alongside." Date, ever suspicious, thought it queer that the skipper should behave so politely, as he had gathered that Hervey was not usually a considerate man. Also, he saw that when the captain was climbing the bank, the boat, in charge of a mate, as the inspector judged from his brass-bound uniform, backed water to the end of the jetty, where it swung against one of the shell-encrusted piles. Hervey finally reached the jetty level, but refused to come onto the same. He beckoned to Don Pedro and his companions to walk forward to the ground upon which he was standing. Also, he seemed exceedingly anxious to take time over the transaction, as even after he had handed the scroll of writing to the Peruvian and had received the gold in exchange, he engaged in quarrelsome conversation. Pretending that he doubted if de Gallegos had brought the exact sum, he opened the canvas bag and insisted on counting the money. Don Pedro naturally lost his temper at this insult and swore in Spanish, upon which Hervey responded with such volubility that anyone could see he was a past master in Castilian swearing. The row was considerable, especially as Random and Hope were laughing at the quarrel. They thought that Hervey was the worse for drink, but Date, clever for once in his life, did not think so. It appeared to him that the boat had gone to the end of the jetty for some reason, connected with the same reason which induced the skipper to spin out the time of the meeting by indulging in an unnecessary quarrel. The skipper also kept his eyes about him, and insisted that the 4 men should keep together at the head of the pier. "I dare say you're trying to play low down on me," he said with a scowl, after satisfying himself that the money was correct, "but I've got my shooter." "So have I," cried Don Pedro indignantly, and slipped his hand round to his hip pocket. "And if you talk any further so insulting, I shall—" "Oh, you bet 2 can play at that game," cried Hervey, and ripped out his own weapon before the Spaniard could produce his derringer. Hands up, or I shoot. But he had reckoned without his host. While covering de Gallegos, he overlooked the fact that Random and Hope were close at hand. The next moment, and while Don Pedro flung up his hands, the ruffian was covered by 2 revolvers in the hands of 2 very capable men. "Great Scott!" cried Hervey, lowering his weapon. "Only my fun, gents. Here, you get back." This was to Inspector Date, who had been keeping his ears and eyes open, and who was now racing for the end of the jetty. Peering over, he uttered a loud cry. "I thought so! I thought so! Here's the nigger and the mummy!" Hervey uttered a curse, and, plunging past the trio, careless of the levelled weapons, ran down to the end of the jetty, and, throwing his arms round Date, leaped with him into the sea. They fell just beside the boat, as Random saw when he reached the spot. A confused volley of curses arose as the boat pushed out from the encrusted pile, the mate thrusting with a boat-hook. Hervey and Date were in the water, but as the boat shot into the moonlight, Random, and now Hope and de Gallegos, who had come up, saw a long green form in amongst the sailors. Also, very plainly, Cockatoo with his great mop of yellow hair. "Shoot! Shoot!" yelled Date, who was struggling with the skipper in the shallow water near shore. "Don't let them escape." Hope ran up the jetty and fired 3 shots in the air, certain that the firing would attract the attention of the 4 or 5 constables on guard at the cottage, which was no very great distance away. Random sent a bullet into the midst of the boatload, and immediately the mate fired also. The bullet whistled past his head, and, crazy with rage, he felt inclined to jump in amongst the ruffians and have a hand-to-hand fight, but de Gallegos stopped him in a voice shrill with anger. Already the shouts and noise of the approaching policemen could be heard. Cockatoo gripped the green mummy case desperately, while the sailors tried to row towards the ship. Then de Gallegos gave a shout and leaped as the boat swung past the jetty. He landed right on Cockatoo, and although a cloud drifted across the moon, Random heard the shots coming rapidly from his revolver. Meanwhile, Hervey got away from Date, as the constables came pounding down the jetty and onto the beach. "Chuck the mummy and nigger overboard and make for the ship," he yelled, swimming with long strokes towards the boat. This order was quite to the sailors' minds, as they had not reckoned on such a fight. 6 willing hands clutched both Cockatoo and the case, and, in spite of the Kanaka's cries, both were hurled overboard. As the case swung overside, de Gallegos, balancing himself at the end of the boat, fired at Cockatoo. The shot missed the Kanaka and pierced the mummy case. Then from it came a piercing yell of agony and rage. "Great God!" shouted Hope, who was watching the battle. "I believe Braddock is in that damn thing!" The next moment, de Gallegos was swung overboard also, and the sailors were lifting Hervey into the boat. It nearly upset, but he managed to get in, and the craft rowed for the vessel, which was again showing a flaring blue light. Random sent a shot after the boat, and then with the policeman ran down to help de Gallegos, who was struggling in the water. He managed to pull him out, and when he had him safe and breathless on shore, he saw that the boat was nearing the ship, and that Date, torn and wet and dishevelled, with 3 policemen, was up to his waist in water, struggling to bring ashore Cockatoo and the mummy case, to which he clung like a limpet. Hope ran down to give a hand, and in a few minutes they had the Kanaka ashore, fighting like the demon he was. Random and de Gallegos joined the breathless group, and Cockatoo was held in the grasp of 2 strong men who required all their strength to hold him, while Date, warned by Hope's cry of what was in the case, tore at the lid. It was but lightly fastened and soon came off. Then those present saw in the moonlight the dead face of Professor Braddock, who had been shot through the heart. As they looked at the sight, Cockatoo broke from those who held him, and, throwing himself on his master, howled and wept as though his heart would break. At the same moment there came a derisive whistle from the Firefly, and they saw the great tramp steamer slowly moving downstream, increasing her speed with almost every revolution of the screw. Braddock had been captured, but Hervey had escaped. At the inquest on the Professor and on the body of Mrs. Jasher, it was proved that Cockatoo had warned his master that the game was up, and had suggested that Braddock should escape by hiding in the mummy case. The corpse of Inca Caxus was placed in an empty Egyptian sarcophagus, in which it was afterwards found, and Braddock, assisted by his faithful Kanaka, wheeled the case down to the old jetty. Here, in a nook where Cockatoo had formerly kept the boat, the Professor concealed himself all that night and all next day. Cockatoo, having got rid of his boat long since, lest it might be used in evidence against him and his master, ran through the dense mist and the long night up to Pierside, where he saw Captain Hervey and bribed him with a promise of £1,000 to save his master. Hervey, having assured himself that the money was safe, since it was banked in a feigned name in Amsterdam, agreed, and arranged to ship the Professor in the mummy case. Thus it was that Hervey kept the 4 men talking up the jetty, as he knew that Cockatoo with his own sailors was shipping the Professor in the mummy case underneath, and well out of sight. Cockatoo had come downstream with the Firefly, and in this way had not been discovered. Throughout that long day, the miserable Braddock had crouched like a toad in its hole, trembling at every sound of pursuit, as he knew that the whole of the village was looking for him. But Cockatoo had hidden him well in the case, in the lid of which holes had been bored. He had brandy to drink and food to eat, and he knew that he could depend upon the Kanaka. Had Date not been suspicious, the ruse might have been successful, but to save himself Hervey had to sacrifice the wretched Professor, which he did without the slightest hesitation. Then came the unlucky shot from the revolver of de Giangos, which had ended Braddock's wicked life. It was fate. At the inquest, a verdict of wilful murder was brought against the Kanaka, but a verdict of justifiable homicide was given in favour of the Peruvian. Thus Cockatoo was hanged for the double murder, and Don Pedro went free. He remained long enough in London to see his daughter married to the man of her choice, and then returned to Lima. Of course the affair caused more than a 9 days' wonder, and the newspapers were filled with accounts of the murder and the projected escape. But Lucy was saved from all this publicity, as, in the first place, her name was kept out of print as much as possible, and, in the second, Archie promptly married her, and within a fortnight of her step, Father's death took her to the south of France and afterwards to Italy. What with his own money, and the money she inherited from her mother, in which Braddock had a life interest, the young couple had nearly 1,000 a year. 6 months later, Sir Frank came into the small San Remo where Mr. and Mrs. Hope lived, with his wife on his arm. Lady Random looked singularly charming and was assuredly more conversational. This was the first time the 2 sets of lovers had met since the tragedy, and now each girl had married the man she loved. Therefore there was great joy. "My yacht is over at Monte Carlo," said Random, "and I am going with Inez to South America. She wants to see her father." "Yes, I do," said Lady Random, "and we want you to come also, Lucy, you and your dear husband." Archie and his wife looked at one another, but declined unanimously. "We would rather stay here in San Remo," said Mrs. Hope, becoming slightly pale. "Don't think me unkind, Inez, but I could not bear to go to Peru. It is associated too much in my own mind with that terrible green mummy." "Oh, Don Pedro has taken that back to the Andes," explained Sir Frank, "and it is now reposing in the sepulchre in which it was placed hundreds of years ago by the Indians, faithful to Inca Caxus. Inez and I are going up to a kind of forbidden city, where Don Pedro reigns as Inca, and I expect we shall have a jolly time. I hear there is some big game shooting there." "What about your soldiering?" asked Hope, rather surprised at this extended tour being arranged. "Oh, my husband has left the army," pouted Inez. "His duties kept him away from me nearly all the day, and I grew weary of being left alone." "So you see, Mrs. Hope," laughed Random gaily, "that I have had to succumb to my fireside tyrant. We shall go and see this fairy city, and then return to my home in Oxfordshire. There Inez will settle down as a real English wife, and I'll turn a country squire. So, after all our troubles, peace will come." "And as you will not come to my country," said Lady Random to her hostess, "you cannot refuse to visit Frank and myself at the Grange. We have had so much trouble together that we cannot lose sight of each other." "No," said Lucy, kissing her. We will come to Oxfordshire." So it was arranged, and the next day Mr. and Mrs. Hope went over to Monte Carlo to see the last of Sir Frank and his wife. They stood on the heights watching the pretty little steamer making for South America. Archie noticed that his wife's face was somewhat sad. "Are you sorry we did not go, sweetheart?" "No," she replied, placing her arm within his own. "I only want to be with you." "That is all right," he patted her hand. "Now that we have sold all the furniture in the pyramids and have got rid of the lease, there will be nothing to remind you of the Green Mummy. Yet I can't help thinking of my unfortunate stepfather, and of poor Mrs. Jasher, and of Sidney Bolton. Oh, Archie, little as we can afford it, I am glad that we allow Mrs. Bolton a small sum a year. After all, it was through my stepfather that her son met with his death." "I don't quite agree with you, dear. Cockatoo's innate savagery was the cause, as Professor Braddock did not intend or desire murder. But there, dear, do not think any more about these dismal things. Dream of the time when I shall be the president of the Royal Academy, and you my lady. I am your lady now." "But," added Lucy, "perhaps from an association of ideas of colour and the Academy, I shall hate green for the rest of my life." "That's unlucky, considering it is nature's colour." "My dear, in a year or two this tragedy, or rather the 3 tragedies, will seem like a dream. I won't listen to another word now. The Green Mummy has passed out of our lives and has taken its bad luck with it." "Amen, so be it," said Lucy Hope, and the happy couple went home, leaving all their sorrows behind them, while the smoke of the steamer faded on the horizon.